I first met John McCain in 1991. It was post the Keating episode, and they were rebuilding a political team for his 1992 reelection. And a guy named Jay Smith, who had been his consultant, asked me to take over the polling. And so we were planning and preparing for what might have been, and was presumed to be at the time, a very, very difficult reelection, given that we were just coming off of the Keating story. Keating story, by the time the election of 1992 came around, John had essentially already been exonerated. He worked so hard to kind of reestablish himself with the Arizona electorate. And so by the time the actual election in 1992 came around, the Keating thing was in the verbatims. People talked about it, but it did not have much bearing on the good feelings people had about the senator and what turned out to be a very comfortable reelection. John McCain is a person for whom personal honor is a very big deal. And when you read his autobiography and he talks about his dad, an officer's code in the Navy, and what's expected of an officer and personal honor, these are the core of who he is. And so the Keating thing was, I think, the first time that somebody had assaulted that core. And when you watch the video of John McCain in that hearing room, he is slumped over and he just looks so miserable. And you can tell this angry frustration that he had done anything that would ever put him in that chair. And I think as well, the anger and frustration he didn't deserve to be in that chair. And they needed a Republican and they needed a bipartisan, and he got stuck. When you know John McCain and you watch that video, you can just tell the devastating consequence it had for him to be in that position. John McCain, he's funny. He's a very engaging, funny guy. And number two, I think when you see him on the road with people, I think he's genuine. He does kind of connect with people, and he's interested in what they say, and there's sincerity to that. And three, the guy's committed. I mean, there's stuff he believes in. He won't back off from it. And in today's politics, and over my 25, 27 years with him, it sort of makes him a unique figure in American politics. But that sort of personal quality of kind of the sense of humor, and then the perspective he has about himself and his ability to make fun of himself, those are all things that don't come easily to the average elected American politician. I think John McCain is a unique United States Senator. He has not only a national standing, but actually international standing. I think of him sometimes, and you look at all the travel he's doing even now, he's sort of America's prime minister all over the world. And I'm not impugning the character of any U.S. senator, but I'm saying I think John's got a unique standing in the public mind. He's seen as a little different than the average elected official, a little more candid, tougher, and much more independent than they perceive most politicians these days, who they see as too connected to either political party. I think that running for president is a transformational experience. And in John's case, and in most of the men, and soon to be more women that I know who've run for president, they're better for the experience. There's the process of going around this country and asking people to vote for you for president. This country has an expectation for what they want to see in their next president. In John's case, I think that led to greater patience. I think he worked even harder at controlling his temper, even harder at working and making sure that he could kind of work across party lines. And I think the guy tried to be the person that the American electorate would like him to be. I mean, because, look, part of who he is an American hero. And he's all the other complicated stuff, and he's all the other stuff that's not perfect, but he is also that. And people want they want to see the best in him. And I think he works really, really hard to control the other side, to be that person that they would like to see him and like him to be. I don't know what makes John McCain or anybody else when they talk about being a leader. I don't know how to quite capture it. What I think is that he is self-possessed, that he has enough internal knowledge about himself, that he sort of knows what he knows and he knows what he doesn't know. And I think people forget that a leader isn't somebody who thinks they're right all the time. A leader is also someone smart enough to ask for help when they need it. But number two, I think when he knows what he knows, he's pretty confident, and he conveys a, look, I've got the answer. This is what we ought to do. It's going to work. And his conviction is compelling. And three, as I said, he has a humor and an infectious quality that kind of binds people and make people believe in the guy. And then look, when he talks about believing in something greater than yourself, when he talks about being separated from this country and the love of country, these just aren't things he says. This is stuff he believes to his core. And so when other people watch him talk about that, and he says, look, I'm appealing to you. Let's do something bigger. Let's do something better for the country. Let's do something bigger than for our own self-interest. These are things he really, really believes, and they're powerful, and most people want to be part of that cause, or a cause. And I think he has the capacity to mobilize that because he so fundamentally believes that about America and what this country can be. And that's a pretty powerful vision. Well, it's, a little bit of that's faded. I mean, it's now a long time ago. Look, there's no question his career in the early 1980s when he was first elected was premised about that and the way he'd been tested and what he'd gone through. And his POW story is not like the other people. He could have left. He was offered to leave. And what's also not very well known is the commanding officer, when everyone agreed, like, the first guy that goes is the guy who's been here the longest, they thought he was going to die. And they said, John, you're so sick, you're going to die. It's okay, you can go. He was kind of offered, not only by the North Vietnamese, but by his own commanding officer telling him, we don't want you to die here, take the deal. For anybody to imagine what he's been through and to volunteer to stay under those circumstances, wow, that's pretty powerful. And it speaks volumes about what was important to him, and it speaks volumes about his character. And that story, it isn't just the story of being a POW, it's the story of a choice he made that no other POW had to make, and the way he handled that. I think that's enduring, and it ought to be important to people. Again, most of us, no one wants to imagine being in the situation that John and those men were in, but who would imagine, given what his commanding officer said, making the decision to stay? And when his prison guard says, now it's going to get very, very bad for you. And it's like, what? I mean, how bad was it already? I mean, those are pretty powerful stories that separate you from all but a very, very small handful of people in this country. Okay, here's some good stories. It's November of 1998, and I do the first kind of premise poll. We do a poll in 4 early primary states, and we kind of compare the John McCain biography to the George Bush biography, and then the 1 or 2 other leading candidates. And normally, when you do that, you make up ground. In other words, everyone knew George W. Bush. Very few people knew John McCain in Iowa and New Hampshire and these early states. So when you describe their bio and background, especially, my gosh, McCain's bio, you do a post ballot and you make up ground. The race gets closer, except it didn't. John McCain was getting crushed in the beginning, and he was getting crushed at the end. And he was losing, and Bush was in the mid-40s. He was in the single digits. We didn't make up ground. Nothing about that poll was promising. And so you present that to the senator and to his, the small group of people who've been with him for a very long time. And then with that good humor, he says, so in other words, they know everything about me and I still get crushed. I said, yes, that's true. And then he says, tell me then, what the hell's the point? I mean, I don't want to do this if I can't win. Why would I do this? And I said, my answer was, because guess what? You believe in stuff. Let me tell you what you believe in. You believe in campaign finance reform. No Republican is going to talk about that issue, and it's never going to happen in this country until someone proves that the American electorate cares about it. And no one's ever going to move in that issue until we can prove that it's a voting issue. And I went through the 2 or 3 things he wanted to talk about in the campaign, and I said, hey, guess what? Who else is going to talk about that stuff? No one. There's one candidate in this race who would talk about those issues, and it's you. And guess what the U.S. presidency allows you to do? Guess what this campaign will allow you to do? It will allow you to demonstrate and talk about what you would do as president that would transform this country and transform this party that nobody else would do. And he said, can I win? I said, well, hey, here's what I believe. In this campaign, George Bush is in the semifinals. He's got a slot. There's going to be somebody that will run against Bush because this country and the press is not going to tolerate a race where somebody just hand the nomination. So I don't know if you can beat George Bush. Let me ask you a question. Do you think you can beat Steve Forbes, Lamar Alexander, Liddy Dole? Can you be the second guy in this race? And he says, God, I hope so. And I said, me too. I hope so too. But if you want to run and if you want to transform environment, the environmental stuff you want to do, campaign finance reform, the stuff you want to do in military security, you're the only guy running who's going to talk about this. So the reason you run is because those issues are so important. They're an opportunity for you to fight for those issues, this party, this nomination. And by the way, what do I believe? I believe that given your bio, given the caliber of those other candidates, and given the power of your story with those issues, yes, I absolutely believe you're going to be the guy standing in the semifinal with Bush. And when that happens, I don't know. We have a shot. So anything can happen. But those issues are not going to be on the front table of this country without your race. So look, he wanted to do it. I mean, that's a nice speech. It's a nice Bill McInturff. I liked saying that story. But John McCain had already, I think the year before, in his heart decided to run. He was waiting for Cindy. He was waiting for his family. The guy wanted to run for president. Now, the other part of the story that I like is he goes, okay, I got it. He was like another half hour. I said, okay, I think I'm going to run. And then he has to go to vote. And then some of the new people who don't know him said, okay, now this is very important, very important. We've got to keep this under wraps, and we have to think about the timing of the announcement. And Mark Salter says, are you nuts? He's going to tell 5 people between here and the vote, including the guy in the elevator. By the time he comes back, everyone in Washington's going to know he's decided to run. He said, there's no secrets. There's no we're going to keep it in the tubes. I mean, the guy's going to run. He's going to tell everybody, and everyone's going to know by the time he gets back. And so when people ask about the Straight Talk Express, what I say is, look, in a John McCain campaign, you had these 2 choices. Choice number 1 is the conventional. Let's have a disciplined campaign where our candidate says something we can predict every day, and we're going to control the message. Or 2, let's have what John McCain's going to say and do, which is whatever he wants every single day to every single question. That's what he's going to do. So why don't we have the good sense to make up a campaign that makes that a virtue and tells people, hey, you want a candidate who's a little bit different, who'll say whatever you want all day long? That's John McCain. And let's make it a virtue and sell it, because that's what he's going to do. And anybody who's worked with him for the previous decade who thinks he's going to be a conventional candidate and under control and message, that's not who this guy is. And the people around him who knew him had the very good sense to say, this is this guy's strengths, and we better create the campaign around what he's going to do as a candidate. And I sure didn't think of things like this, but that's where the Straight Talk Express came from, because it was taking what authentically what he's like, which you can't control and you can't change, and making it an attribute in a campaign. He's charming. He's funny. Sitting around talking with John McCain, driving around a bus, he's good at it. And here's the other thing you have to remember. Candidates run in a certain zeitgeist. You have to go back to 1998 and early 1999. You have to think about President Clinton. You've got to think about the Monica Lewinsky story. You have to think about how Americans embarrassed they were by that story. You have to put yourself in that perspective. And so when we ask people, what are you looking for in terms of a president, in terms of who you want to vote for, we always vote for the opposite person that we've just had. In Clinton's case, despite those personal skills and his job approval, all of that stuff was the zeitgeist of 1999 and 1990 and 2000. They were looking for a person where they could feel proud of the American president and that was era, his character. So what do you have? You've got a POW war hero that, and then that embodies those qualities. And then when you were with him, the other thing that this country wanted, it was so powerful. When John talks about love of country, of military duty, of service, and Vietnam. Vietnam, you got to go back to 1999. It was still very raw. And so when he wrote the book and the book came out, people would be in lines, they would be at events, they would have the book, and here's what they did. They would show pictures of themselves serving in Vietnam. They would show pictures of their family. They would show pictures of their loved one. And all they would kept saying to him is, thank you. Thank you for talking about service, for what Vietnam meant, for the pride you should feel because you tried to serve your country. And they were so powerful, wanting somebody to express that pride and the service they had committed to this country, and including the poor men and women who were there with pictures of people we lost in Vietnam. And John became a way to, I think, for people to express that. And of course, what I'm saying is every day when you're on the road and you're John McCain and people have that kind of reaction to you and expectation, I'm saying, John, as I said, for someone who'd known him a long time already and seen him in campaigns, he worked so hard to be that guy. And it was, we all have good sides, bad sides. John's got a good side, he's got a bad side. But this was John McCain's good side, day after day after day after day, over and over and over again, because he worked so hard to be that guy. And John McCain's good side is a pretty attractive side to see every day. Okay, so now it's right after Thanksgiving, it's early December, and we didn't have any money to speak of, so we had not done our own New Hampshire polling in like a year. And we were looking at public polls. We didn't have our own polls with our own screens and the way I would look at the electorate. So when you design a survey, you have what's called a clean ballot. How's McCain, Bush, and all the other candidates? And then we did a whole series of John McCain will say this, George Bush will say this, here's the campaign, now how would you vote? And so so we do the first night interviews, and of course, I can't sleep, or it's like because once you do the first couple of interviews with it, you don't have everything you need about a poll, but you know what's going to happen. So Elizabeth, the project director, Harrington, calls me at 2 in the morning because I said I want to see these partials as soon as they call, and I ask her, and I say to her, "What's the ballot?" And she goes, "McCain +5." And I said, "I don't want the post ballot. I want the clean ballot in the beginning." And she goes, "I know that. I gave you the clean ballot, McCain +5." And then I can't breathe. You're telling me we have a poll in December where we're already ahead? And so I'm gasping for air. I can't breathe. I'm like, and then she goes, "Are you okay? Are you going to die? Should I call the ambulance?" And I said to her later, "Could you express some emotion? Could you express like you were concerned that I couldn't breathe?" I finally said, "What's the post ballot?" She goes, "We're up by 19. And I said, "Oh my God." And I said to her after I could breathe again, I said, you understand the following things, Elizabeth. 2, he's going to probably win New Hampshire unless the Bush campaign has this data and radically changes what they're doing. We're going to win New Hampshire. And 2, it's not going to be close. And I said, 3, you understand something really, really, really important and freaking cool, There are two people in all of the world who know this, and it's you and I at 2 in the morning. And she says, do you really think so? I said, oh. I said, Elizabeth, I wrote the survey. I know what's going to happen. The Bush people aren't going to change. Unless they get this right now and they understand what's happening, they're going to lose, and it's going to be big. It's going to be, the guy could be president. That's what this means. That's why I couldn't breathe. That's what this poll is about. Okay. So the Bush campaign stays positive. They don't, unbelievably, they stay positive. They never react. We get to run that campaign. We did run that campaign. And so our internal tracking keeps getting better and better and better. And so then it's the Sunday before New Hampshire. It's actually the Super Bowl. We've got to do all the calls. And, before the Super Bowl, Elizabeth calls me, and we're 16, 17 points ahead. And I said, oh, my God, I can't give him plus 16. Oh, my God. And so I weight down independence, and I do everything you can do to a survey. And so she finally calls back and said, well, we got it down to 9, but unless you're going to make up a ballot, that's the lowest this gets. And I said, okay. So John's doing his last events, and Rick Davis and Mark Salter and the guys are in the follow-up car. And so I call Rick Davis, and he says, McInturff, what's the number? And I said, well, first you understand it's Super Bowl, it's a weird day to call, and you don't know about independence. And he says, he said, come on, stop the bullshit. What's the number? And then I finally said, no, plus 9. He burst out laughing, and he holds the phone. He turns out and says, oh my God, it's so big he can't get it below 9. I know McInturff. He was desperate to make it as bad as possible. The worst he could make it was 9. Oh my God, we're going to win by so much. And of course, everyone's laughing. And then, my firm got fired from the Dole campaign 4 years earlier, so our numbers are right, but that didn't change what happened. So on election day in New Hampshire, everyone else is feeling pretty good. I'm kind of wrapped in a fetal position, whimpering. And so the first exit polls come out, and we're like 16 or 18 ahead. And so David said, okay, get off the couch, quit your whimpering. Your stuff is exactly right. I know, America knows it wasn't 9. You know how big it was going to be. That's what's going to happen. And of course, yes, it was. And Elizabeth Harrington got to be there. We were one of 4 or 5 people who got to tell John McCain what that number was going to be. And of course, John McCain's word is steady strain. The steady strain is when you're a POW for those years, you hold yourself together by not going too low. Steady strain. All the talk about we're going to get out, you got to keep that under wraps. It's steady strain. And so when I got to tell him that number, he was shocked, and you could see the shock in his face. And he said, Is that really what's going to happen? I said, really? And then he said, what's that mean? And then Mark Salter said, what it means is you might have a shot to be the next U.S. president. And of course, that hits you. I mean, there's a difference between your run versus you really think like, oh my God, I could be the next president. And then he kind of shut down, and you could see him going into a steady strain mode, which is a very quiet, disciplined, and he's in steady strain mode. So the reason that was not a happy night for me is I'd also been doing all the work in South Carolina, and I could never get him above 45 or 46. And I didn't, so while everybody else was celebrating, I was already we're tracking that night in South Carolina, and how different that was going to be. So the happy night for me was not New Hampshire. My happy night was in early December, when I was one of the 2 people who knew where that campaign was headed. Well, people forget my job, which is I was also the person who then told John and Cindy the numbers in South Carolina. So you don't get very many days in between those 2 things. So And of course, John's John. He loves polling. He loves what we do, and he has a really, really good sense. And so when he said same thing, are you sure? I mean, South Carolina, when you said this isn't going to happen, and he said he's sure, I had to give him here's the Veterans Cross tab, which is, we're kind of breaking even. And of course, look, it's very simple. In New Hampshire, independents were 40% plus of the sample, and we were crushing Bush. In South Carolina, religious conservatives were 40% of the sample, and John's losing by 25 or 30 points. There's not enough vote left. You can't beat the guy by enough votes to make that up. I know, again, John personally feels, and this is John personally feels that the Confederate flag was a moment where he drifted away from his own standard. He apologized for it that year. Obviously, he still carries that forward. It had zero to do with the outcome of that election. And so for John, this is a moment where he did not live up to his own standards. And again, what I tell people is if you want to understand John McCain, you have to read the book, and there's like a page for his dad's in Hawaii, and he goes through the officer code. And he says, this is the officer code if you're a U.S. naval officer. Now, I've been around John for 26 or 7 years. He's not a perfect guy. On every single day, at every single occasion, I've seen him slip off that code. The difference is, this is what good people do. They say, oops, I made a mistake. That's not the way. I didn't handle that right. I didn't live up to my own internal standard of how I want to see myself. The guy has a corrective instinct to try to be a decent human being and get back to that. My point is, compared to lots of other people who run for office, I know that there's an animating core to who John McCain and how he wants to see himself and the way he wants to operate in his life. And it's a pretty attractive standard. But the point was, I'd known him a long time before I read the book. And then when I read the book, and I said, oh my God, I got it. This is the standard he's trying to live up to. The point of that story, and the reason it's in the Hawaii chapter, is because it's a terrible story about a naval officer who killed somebody, then used enlisted men to help try to cover it up. And obviously, it's a horrible story. But the point of that story was, oh my God, you can't be an officer in the U.S. Navy and then use your power and rank to try to take advantage of enlisted people, because there's nothing that violates that core in terms of one of the things you cannot do as a naval officer. And so when I read that, when I read the standards of what his dad would impart and what's expected, that's when I realized, okay, I got it. I didn't know what it was, or I couldn't be so articulate, but this is what the guy's been trying to do. So the Confederate flag story is a point where John says, I have my own internal standards and I failed. And as I said, in an attractive way, in my mind, he apologized. And my God, that's, what is that, 2000? That's 17 years ago. And he's still talking about the ways in which he sees that as a personal failure. I find that to be an attractive quality. Here's another thing that's made me a little different in my career and why I'm only a small footnote in most of these books. I think candidates and their wives should have a zone of privacy. So I've been telling stories from my perspective about things I've seen about John. I think John and Cindy should have a zone of privacy. So, what I tell people as well, when you are with these people, when you read the press about Obama this or Trump or any of these people, Clinton, any of these people, we talk about them like they're robots. They're sort of like mystical political figures. If you work with these men and women every day, they're real people. And obviously, but I also say look, they're real people who are under enormous strain, who don't get a lot of sleep, and guess what? Like 7 billion other human beings, if you don't get much sleep under enormous pressure, you're not really at your best. And you know what? The people around you ought to be loyal enough to say, that's not this guy at his best. And, I've known this guy a long time, and I don't think that's the way he would normally say or do things, and I should give him a little slack. And occasionally, very rarely, I'd say, John, you know what, before you get going, I don't think I'm seeing at your best. Why don't we take a breath here, John? And then, because he'll be, oh, okay. Because he's been pretty nice to me for the most part. So, yes, John and Cindy, I was there telling them what was going to happen, but I think that ought to be John and Cindy's private moment, and the private moment would happen in that room, and that's up to John and Cindy to tell. Yeah, well, here's what I hope to happen. Well, I mean, New Hampshire was so big that it wiped out Steve Forbes in their campaign. My hope was, in South Carolina, okay, here's what's going to happen. We can get to 45 or 46. Bush is going to be right around there, but Steve Forbes and this other guy, maybe they get 10 or 12. And that we can drain off enough of this vote so that a 45 can win this race. What happened was New Hampshire was so massive, and it so instantly became Bush-McCain, that we wiped out all the other places for votes to go. And structurally, in South Carolina, it's a very simple polling issue. The very simple polling issue is if 40% of the electorate is religious conservatives and you lose them by, here's the math, it's 40% religious conservative, you lose them by 30 points, you're down 12 points. That means with the 60% of everybody else, you gotta beat George Bush by, like 20 points to get even. And you can't beat a Bush in South Carolina by that much to make up that margin. And look, there was a debate when, in the fall of 1999, where they asked the candidates, who's your favorite philosopher? It was sort of like a off-the-wall question, how much of these, at that time men, they were all men, how much of these guys thought of, oh no, actually Liddy Dole was there. But, everyone's picking their favorite philosopher, they had something to say, and George Bush said Jesus Christ. George Bush, in his personal life, is a genuinely committed Christian, and when he said Jesus Christ, I think he meant that really is someone whose philosophy he saw himself adopting. That was a genuine part of who this guy was. He had incredibly strong support in the religious community, and then in the bridge of the Republican structure of the leadership of the Christian conservative part, they were Bush people. And you combine sort of the Bush family with the religious conservative part, and you put yourself in South Carolina, the remarkable stuff is, if it weren't for the huge surge in who voted, it shouldn't have been, we made this a very close campaign despite all that stuff. And by the way, I'm a Bush person. I started my career working for, in the 1999 presidential campaign for his dad. I've done Jeb stuff. I'm a long-term Bush person. And I understand the structural advantage that he had in the race. It's very simple. Look, Texas was essentially, you can see Texas, California at that time was winner take all. Once you lose California, you can't, there are no delegates left. As Rick Davis one time joked, when we were talking about the rules of the 2016 race and California no longer being winner take all and the new rules, and he said, wow, if we'd had those rules in 2000, John'd still be running. But that wasn't the structure of the 2000 campaign. Well, first, let me be honest with you, okay? Which is, there's nothing that helps your numbers than not being president. So when people look at, oh, look, John McCain was ahead of Al Gore by whatever, 14 points in the spring. So we lose, McCain's out, and you look at these polls, and like George Bush is ahead by 4, and Gore and McCain's winning by 12. Well, yeah, because George Bush is running and he's getting trashed every day. John McCain's the guy who's not getting trashed every day. So I have to be honest with you and say, as a pollster, nothing becomes you like not being a president or being in the race. You become what John is. You're an American hero who people saw as a straight shooter, who bridges party divides, and you're not getting trashed every day. And that's a lot more attractive than being the American president, where every single day somebody's dumping on you. But again, I think that what happened is in this campaign, and what happened in 2000 is because again, it was very hard for John to make the decision to get out of the race when he did. He made the right decision, but it was very hard. Rick Davis said to him, look, you're not the same person going back to the U.S. Senate. Because what McCain had in his mind was his friends who he'd seen run for president, you get embarrassed, and it's like you come back tail between your legs. And Rick said, look, John, this is just the opposite. 2 years ago, you were like, okay, people know you were, but today, you are kind of America's leading kind of independent political figure. And when you go back to the U.S. Senate, you're going back as a national hero with the strongest possible approvals. You have now literally a 2 million person donor list. You have the largest donor list in the country other than the Bushes. And you're going to be the guy that every single Republican is going to want to campaign for them. And you're going to be the linchpin of what does and does not happen in the U.S. Senate. You left with this sort of status, you're going to come back as, along with Ted Kennedy, the two most famous, best known, most influential U.S. senators. And you're going to come back enhanced in stature. And you're going to, and like campaign finance reform, look, it worked. That issue got passed because of that campaign and the way John dragged the issue forward, and Bush had to live with it. That would have never happened without that campaign. And all the other stuff that John's done with that leverage has been because of that campaign. And, you know, we're watching an analog today because, again, Bernie Sanders, you know, no one likes Bernie in the U.S. Senate. He's not even a Democrat. But today, he's sitting here as, again, arguably one of the most single most influential U.S. senators because he went back to the U.S. Senate enhanced in power. It's very, very rare, but John McCain did it, and now 16 years later, so did Bernie Sanders. Well, you know, in defense of some decisions that were made, had Rudy Giuliani not run, the presumption was that, look, the Republican Party nominates the next guy in line. John McCain is the next person in line. He can run and raise $100 million. We can do what Bush did 8 years earlier, and we can be that guy. That wasn't crazy. All of that could have been possible. And in a race where Rudy Giuliani did not run, I think that would have happened. Instead, Rudy Giuliani did run, and guess what? He and McCain were sitting on the same sort of block of people, voters, and money. And arguably, it might have been a little better for the campaign if much, much, much earlier people would have acknowledged that the assumptions they made were no longer correct, but that didn't happen. Instead, instead, Rudy Giuliani and John are splitting the vote and the money, and you built a campaign based on the wrong assumption about funding levels, and you end up broke, and you end up with where John ended up. I love Ann Landers. I would read Ann Landers every day. There's now a PhD thesis. This woman wrote a book about how America changed through the filter of Ann Landers' response to similar questions by decade. So this woman writes to Ann Landers, and she says, look, my husband keeps having affairs. He promised me he'd stop, but he keeps doing it. What can I do what's going to stop my husband from having affairs? And Ann Landers wrote back, rigor mortis. So during the death watch of the August of 2008, all these reporters would call saying, why doesn't McCain get out? I'd hate to see John like this. I love John. It's so humiliating. It's so embarrassing. When's he going to quit? Why would he quit? When's it going to happen? Isn't he going to quit? And I would say to them, look, I mean, do you know anything? I mean, do you read the bio? Okay, let's forget the POW stuff. Do you actually know how the guy won his first congressional race? He won his congressional race in a competitive race where if you're the Republican nominee or get to be members of Congress, there's 7 people running. No one knows who he is. He went to 25,000 doors for a year and a half, 4 to 6 hours a day. 25,000 doors, 4 to 6 hours a day of door-to-door campaigning. You know how hot it is who does that? People say they, quote, go door to door. That means you have a picture taken with some prearranged person at the door shaking your hand who loves you. 4 to 6 hours in a campaign for 25,000 people? Well, first, of course he won, because people like the guy. You meet John McCain, you like him. But 2, nobody does that. And I said, so here's what's going to happen. I said, he's going to fly to New Hampshire, and he'll go door to door. There'll be no money left, and he'll say, screw it. And he'll go door to door. And you know what? They're going to like him. and number two, he's not going to quit because guess what he believes in? He believes in saving Iraq. There's no other person in this race who's going to say this every day, and he's not going to stop because he believes in something for this country's future that no one else believes in, and when he's like that, he's never going to stop. And I told him my Ann Landers story, and I said, guess what will make him stop? Rigor mortis. Failing that standard, John McCain can be beaten, he could lose his nomination, but for God's sakes, he's not going to quit. Have you ever heard my story about John's story to me about his favorite part of the campaign?
No, please tell.
All right, so it's a year later. We've lost, it's 2009, it's the 1-year anniversary, and Rick Davis always does these nice events. He has a private dinner with the McCain loyalists of McCain, and there's Joe Lieberman, and the 30 people who've been with John forever. And so I got to sit next to John at the table. And so I'm trying, I'm saying, hey, John, you ran for president, John, what's your favorite memory from the campaign in 2008? What's your favorite memory? Because a lot of grim stuff happened, but what's your favorite memory? And he says, well, I guess it was August of 2007. And I said, really? That's a surprise, John. What about August 2007 is your favorite memory? He said, we were in Michigan, and my press crowds are way up again, all of which because they wanted to be there when I quit. He said, so once again, I had the press with me. We were campaigning in Michigan, and we were supposed to do an outdoor event, and it started raining. So the geniuses on my advance team decide the only place they can find that's big enough to fit the little crowd that I had was a funeral home. And we put the event in like one of the rooms of the funeral home across the street from the park. And I'm looking around and I'm saying, what? They put me in a funeral home? What are they thinking? The lead writes itself today. The dying John McCain campaign was literally in the funeral home as they hear the last gasp of the dying campaign. He said, that was my favorite memory. So when I tell people the guy has sort of a sardonic sense of humor and ability to laugh at himself, telling me a year after you've lost the presidency that your favorite memory is the funeral home event in Michigan in 2007 is sort of the McCain moment. I'm going to have another long talk with John. Let me tell you, this is what this means is, for God's sakes, okay, we had this conversation. John wanted to pick Joe Lieberman, okay? Guess what? So we're in the room, and John's with Cindy, and and he says, look, I want to, I think to bridge America, we ought to have, pick Lieberman. And okay, it's an exciting campaign. If you're just sitting around the abstract, that's sort of interesting. But I said, okay, here's time out. Has anyone in this room actually read the rules of the Republican National Committee and its convention rules? Has anybody here read them? Do you understand what's in them? What's in them is that if a majority of 4 delegations ask for a roll call vote, they can demand a roll call vote. So if you pick a pro-choice Democrat to be the vice president of the United States of America on a Republican ticket, hey guys and women around the room, you've lived in the Republican Party all your life. Do you think there's 4 delegations who are going to take a pause and say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to vote for a pro-choice Democrat to be my party's vice president? So what do you think they're going to do? First, they're going to have a roll call vote. And instead of having us pick a vice president, there's going to be a roll call vote. And 2, they're going to nominate somebody. And somebody, by the way, probably credible. It's not going to be some unknown delegate. There's going to be somebody who says, you know what, the right to life issue is kind of important to me. And I don't think I want to have a Democrat pro-choicer heading our party ticket. And instead of our having a convention, we're going to have a bloodbath on the convention floor just to nominate him that we might lose. So in the artificial world of you believe you can pick who you want to be vice president, I would have loved to have done that campaign. It would have been really fun. But it's not reality. It would never happen. It would have been a bloodbath on the convention floor, even if you could have won the vote. Okay, and then there was also a discussion, including John considering, you know what I should do? I should run as a national unity ticket with Joe Lieberman and say I'm going to run one term. And we're going to fix the country, we're going to bridge the gap, we're going to get stuff done, that's what America wants. That's a really fun campaign. And then John, reflecting on that, said, yeah, but guess what? If I did that, every single human being in the U.S. Senate or House would realize that I'm gone in 4 years and I have zero leverage. People don't understand the leverage of the American presidency is based on the premise that people support you and that you're around to punish them. So if you pull either one of those plugs, it's a nothing burger job. And so John correctly made the realization, like, oh, I can't say that. I could even do it internally in my brain. The minute I say it, I'd have zero power as president. So this notion that somehow you could have imagined a McCain-Lieberman ticket does not flow, that was what's going to happen. And by the way, here's the other thing I keep saying to people, okay, let's presume that somehow you could have got Lieberman nominated. And we actually ran that campaign and the same result happened. And this is my other ultimate point in that room. Okay, guys, John McCain just became this Republican Party's nominee. We all know the men and women who've spent 20 or 30 or 40 years as precinct committee people, they're proud of this party, and you're telling them, my successor, should I die, is going to be a Democrat. That's number one. But number two, if we lose this campaign, you know what's going to happen? You're going to fracture the Republican Party around the issue of abortion and social issues. It's not going to hurt all the other little people running for office everywhere. There's no united Republican Party. There's going to be huge chunks of this party would sit it out because they're not going to support the nominee. You fracture the Republican Party, and then you're not the guy who lost. You're the guy who lost and fractured the Republican Party. And institutionally, my other point was institutionally, you have an obligation to the Republican Party, and you are its nominee. And I said, hey, it's America. If you want to run with Joe Lieberman, who's a great guy, and I know how much you like him, it's a great pitch, but we should have done that a year ago and made up our own political party and made it up a year ago, and you could have run as a third party. I think you might have won. Could have been pretty compelling. That you could have done. You can't sit here in July pretending that you think Joe Lieberman can be the vice president of the Republican Party. So let me tell you, the facts of the case have not changed, which is, it wouldn't have happened for all the reasons I'm mentioning, but had it happened, had he tried to do it, there would not be like, the John McCain of today. There only would have been a lot of very, 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 very angry people who never forgave him for fracturing the Republican Party. By the way, so you can just tell when you see John, say, I'm sorry I missed him, and say, Bill McInturff has two messages for you. For God's sakes, he feels badly for you, how badly you feel about the Confederate flag. It did not affect the race. And two, you can't survive a floor vote for a Democrat as vice president. And say McInturff's not changed his views on these two issues. I think people have sort of this glow about the 2000 campaign that's a little bit unwarranted. And the 2008 campaign was enormously well within conventional limits. And again, John was mindful every single day that he was running against an African-American candidate and that we needed to bring out the best in this country in this debate. And I don't know anybody who, in himself or this campaign, that could have worked harder to make sure that any fissures that exist in this country, which are massive and important around race, were not exacerbated because of his campaign. I think that's a legacy, part of the legacy of what he wanted to do personally, that I think happened. Look, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, sayonara, my only hope would have been, I wish Lehman Brothers collapsed in December and we could have run this race without it. I don't know we would have won. It would have been very close. But the campaign we were going to run was going to be very ideological. meaning that Barack Obama was not just a moderate Democrat. If you look at his voting record in the state Senate and the U.S. Senate, he was a very liberal guy. And ironically, McCain, who has been, moderate, working across both parties, all this stuff, we would have run an incredibly ideological campaign. And today that would have been perceived as divisive. When Lehman Brothers collapsed, there was functionally no campaign. We do a question called right direction, wrong track. Pretty much you think the country's in the right direction, wrong track. After the collapse of Lehman Brothers, we dropped below 10% right direction. I mean, you're not going to reelect an incumbent Republican Party if only 8% of the people in the country think the country's in the right direction. You're like a goner. The senator has a sense of humor, and he said to me, have you ever seen right direction this low? I said, yes, sir, I have. He goes, where? And I said, Bulgaria, right after they left the Russian orbit. And our first poll in Bulgaria, it was this low. And then I said, when Mike Dukakis was leaving Massachusetts and they elected Bill Weld for the first time, right direction was this single digits. And then, of course, he laughed. He said, so you're telling me that, yes, you've seen worse in Bulgaria and in Massachusetts when they were willing to vote for a Republican. I said, yes, sir, that's the 2 times. And he said, so you're telling me this is not going to go well? I said, look, don't worry, we're going to keep trying. But, the Lehman Brothers collapse took a horrible environment, horrible, and then just made the campaign impossible. And at that point, you keep throwing stuff against the wall. And there was some stuff that was not particularly disciplined, that was crazy, that just happens. Well, I'm a Bork guy. I think Robert Bork was an enormously qualified U.S. Supreme Court nominee, and I have an interesting, unusual background. I worked for Elliot Richardson. And so, Elliot's version is, Bork fired the special prosecutor. We begged him to stay to do it, to not create a constitutional crisis. I think that what happened with Bork was, in my mind, a defining negative moment that's unleashed unleashed the stuff that's happened. And then, and look, it's like Spy versus Spy in Mad Magazine. Every offense leads to some other offense, and we've just been on this massive negative spiral. And then I have actually a lot of pollster stuff about the country in terms of how polarized the country's got. But in terms of the behavior in Washington, I think the Bork hearings were a big deal. As a pollster, our job is to go out and interview voters and ask voters how they perceive the candidates, and then we do a lot of simulation where we give them different issues, and we test a lot of different language to figure out how best to communicate a message. I think one of the misnomers are that somehow pollsters kind of define what a campaign says. That's not true. It's really not true in a John McCain campaign. John McCain's going to say what he wants to say. He's a little bit amenable to, okay, John, if you're going to say that's what you believe, here's 3 different ways you can say it. Would you please say it this way? Because if you say it this way, people are willing to listen and they kind of agree with it more. And, I don't change what he's going to say. I hopefully help magnify the impact of what he's going to say. But I've been doing campaigns a long time. I've been with John since 1991. I don't think John McCain does not worry about my loyalty. He knows I'm a McCainiac and I love the guy and I want him to do well. And so in addition to that, you become part of hopefully a trusted, valuable circle where you can bounce stuff off and ask for advice and help. And then in something I was pleased to be part of, in the 99-2000 campaign, we had different issues committees, and Rick Davis, the manager, asked me to sit on each of the issue committees to try to influence and give them some outside perspective about each of these different issues. So when the Washington Post did here's the profile of the campaign, they had sort of who were the policy people, and I was on the political side, and I was one of the people on the policy side. So that was nice, and I had a little bigger role on both sides of the 2000 campaign, trying to influence and work with a lot of the new folks who were helping craft policy about how to say what John wants to get done in some powerful way. What allowed John McCain to win the last campaign is, guess what? He's worked very hard for Arizona. I mean, the guy goes back there all the time. He has maintained personal connections and relationships all around the state, and he really works hard on state issues. And so there are U.S. senators who become big international, national figures, and you never see them. I don't think that's a fair description of John McCain in Arizona. So that's number one. And number two, it could have been terrifying. We had a very difficult primary, and we could have a very terrifying general election. But one thing that happened, what behind the scenes that worked really well, is that we kept the money out. A lot of the outside groups that can influence the Republican primary did not, I mean, some families did, and there are some groups, but this enormous, like we just watched in Alabama, $10 million by outside groups, that didn't happen in Arizona. And then in the general election, that didn't happen. And we ran really like the old-fashioned campaigns, where we got to run against our opponents, not a lot of outside money, and in that world where you could keep millions and millions of dollars out. I mean, John's a popular enough figure that you could survive both races. But they were very tough, and they could have been infinitely tougher given what those numbers looked like. I try to tell people who ask about what John's really like, and what I say is he's a combat fighter pilot. And, there was this, in the 2000 New Hampshire campaign, there was gosh, is he mentally unstable? I mean, what human being could go through what he went through, and is he too aggressive, and is he too this? And we interview people on the telephone, and we collect their responses, and this very old World War II veteran said, I'll tell you what he is. He's a combat fighter pilot. You ever met these guys? We get these little small guys, we put them in a plane, and we tell them to be incredibly aggressive and blow people out of the sky. That's what he is. And what I tell people is, guess what? He's a combat fighter pilot. He's a pretty cranked up, intense guy that America decided to spend a lot of money to train, to put behind a jet pilot to shoot people down. And that's his personality. And today, maybe in his 80s, he's a little more temperate than he was when he was in his 20s. But he's a pretty intense, cranked up guy. And he's an affectionate guy, but he's pretty tightly wrapped. And this country picked him to say, you know what, those are the kind of guys who make good fighter pilots. And that's in the enduring part of who he is. And so he can be affectionate, but he's affectionate in a very gruff way. And I can tell you the story about my kid for how he expresses affection in the John McCain way to let you know he likes you. But that's not the typical way, That's a very different era. That part of who he is can be, as I said. And then the other thing I tell them is I said, look at his bio. He barely survived high school. He talks about barely surviving as, fifth from the bottom of his class. Somebody had to lie and cover for him, break the code to keep him in school, because he had too many points. I asked him the Arizona primary. I was in his kitchen in 2000, and because it really hit me. I'd known him for a long time, but it really hit me. I said, God, the guy could be president. Well, what's that like? And I said to him, John, what's it like to go vote where you vote for yourself for president? It's not a joke. I mean, I could write myself in, but that's a joke. I mean, it wasn't a joke. And in a rare reflective moment, he really stopped, and he said, well, not bad for a guy who finished fifth from the bottom of his class. But the other part of who he is you read those stories about high school and college and the rebelliousness and the stand up to authority and, the guy who defended the Filipino staff against a senior and all those other story after story after story. And what I say to people is, my old boss used to say we have the defects of our qualities, which is our best qualities when unchecked can become weaknesses. And I said, John McCain has the qualities of his defects, meaning that terrible rebelliousness and that anti-institutional streak and stand up to authority, all of that stuff, he got put as a POW. And you know what? Now he really had an enemy of enormous weight and magnitude and consequence, but that's the structure of who he was. And so when we had to, in the 2000 campaign, release his medical records, and we let the press read them for hours. We kept them in a room. They could read it for hours and hours and hours. As you know, Rick Davis said, he said, boy, John McCain is one lucky guy despite all the terrible stuff that happened in his life. I said, what? He said, well, guess what we read? We read a psychiatrist who said, look, anybody was affected, but John McCain walked out of that as better than any of these other guys because he walked into it with a rebellious streak that found a way to express itself. And two, it said he had an IQ of 140. He said he's like literally a genius. And they said, so after, and he said, and we learned a lot about hemorrhoids. So, you know, so those are, so when you want to understand John McCain, I tell people you got to understand combat fighter pilot and the quality of our defects. That the qualities that were sort of unchecked and uncontrolled as in high school and in the Naval Academy became the very qualities that allowed him to survive that horrible ordeal, and they become the qualities that now have created this incredibly attractive political persona, because he's found a way to temper them over time to work with other people, and in a way that is, you know, really powerful, watching him try to marshal those and keep those forces under control. So my kid's in high school, and he was already in high school like 6'4", very, very happy with himself. And so he goes to private school. You get 2 weeks off to do an internship in February. I call the office and say, could my kid please be an intern? And they said, sure, of course he can. This is after the 2008 campaign. And then the nice woman who I've known forever says, oh, look, we like high school kids, and we'll take care of them. They get a little intimidated, and they're very young, but we'll take good care of them. I said, no, this kid's way too happy with himself. Please make sure he doesn't steal McCain's voting card and start showing up on the floor. He needs to be whooped and beaten into shape. So we have this picture. You know, McCain, you know, is very nice to him. And so we have this, it's his last day. They come in for the classic picture of him and John McCain. You see the picture, and I said, wow, Adam, you look sort of uncomfortable. What happened? He said, oh my God, you can't believe what the senator said to me. I said, well, what'd he say? And he said, well, I walked in the room. He said, hey, Adam, this must be so impressive for you. U.S. Senator, private office, a little picture. You must be very, very impressed. But you know what? If it weren't for your effing dad and the stupid effing stuff he told me to effing do, I would be in the White House, and I'd have a rose garden behind me right now. Now, that would be effing impressive, wouldn't it? But no, your effing dad screwed this up, and I'm still stuck in this effing little office because of your effing dad. You go tell your effing dad, I don't like being here anymore. I wish I had a rose garden. Except he didn't say the word effing. And so, yeah, my kid looked a little uneasy. And so my kid calls me, and I said, Adam. I said, that is such a compliment. I said, what? I said, because you are 16 or 17 years old, and he spent enough time with you, you know you could take it. He was, guess what? Adam, if he really believed that, you wouldn't have been his intern. If he really believed that, you wouldn't have been taking the picture in the office. And 3, you just passed the John McCain test. The guy loves you, and he's teasing you, and he's showing you that's John's way of being affectionate. He's telling you, I think you're a good kid. I like you. I like your dad. And he's giving you a hard time because he likes you and he thinks you can take it. He gave you the ultimate John McCain compliment. There's a picture of me and John on the New York Times the day after. In 2000, he won Michigan in a huge upset, and he won Arizona. And there's a picture of me sitting next to John, front page of the New York Times, and John McCain's got his head back, and he's just laughing his ass off. And of course, it was picked as the picture because it was like, hey, happy John McCain picture. He just won these primaries. The reason he's laughing is I came in to give him the exit polls, happy, after South Carolina. And I do all that, and he goes through all of his questions. And then he says, and then I said, John, I've got to tell you one more story. And he said, what? And I said, well, I called my wife, and I was pretty emotional. And I said, honey, we're going to win both these races, and we're still in this race. She said, well, before I get too happy, I want you to call into the machine and hear the call from Adam's teacher. Adam was at that point in 2nd grade. This is the kid who, so he's in 2nd grade. I call in, it's the 2nd grade teacher with that 2nd grade teacher voice saying, Mr. and Mrs. McInturff, I've got a tell you about a little episode today in the schoolyard. I've been a teacher 26 years. I've never seen anything like this. So what had happened was Adam was in the schoolyard with another McCain boy, and all the Bush boys, the other second graders, started teasing him and saying, McCain's too liberal, McCain's too liberal, McCain's too liberal. But then they said the fighting words. They said, McCain's so liberal, he's like Bill Clinton. Well, my second grader knows when they drop the Clinton card, you go postal. So they get into a second grade brawl because my kid's defending John McCain. And they get in a brawl, second grade brawl. So the teacher brings them all back in the room. They're all crying. She puts them in different corners, and they talk about parents can be a little crazy about politics. Little guys don't have to. We can talk about differences. We don't have to fight. And she puts them all in the corner, and they're all talking their feelings and all their stuff. And I said to John, I think the Bush boys were seeing their ambassadorship slipping between their fingers, for their parents. And so then she brings Adam out outside, and she says, Adam, are you feeling better? And are you feeling calmer? Are you feeling better? And she said, they insulted me, they insulted my father, and they insulted John McCain. They insulted everything I believe in this world. And I will do it again if they insult me, John McCain, or my father. That's the story I told him. And the reason he's laughing like crazy, I was saying, I want you to know, it's next generation out there defending you, big guy. We're not going to let you be called liberal in our backyard, buddy. And and that picture is the reason he's laughing his ass off in the New York Times. No, I've not. I've sent him some notes, but I have not talked to him personally. The notes I've sent him is that when his daughter said that he was the most composed of everybody around him, I said, I know you're being steady strain. And I believe when she wrote about how John is handling this, I know that he's being steady strain. Whatever the personal consequence to him, that's how he would handle this. But I also said that I'm sure he will do what he's done his whole life. Because I've now gotten calls and letters from other people who know cancer survivors or veterans or others or people with cancer who've asked me to have John call them or have John send them a note because they were looking to John to once again, I think, demonstrate what he's always demonstrated in terms of being a leader, which is how you deal with something this bad and this horrible. And they're asking John to kind of now fill that role. So Rick Davis said to me last time, hey, this is the last time, this is getting too tough. We don't want to do any more of these reelects. And I said, hey, I just assume John's going to call me up at any moment and tell me he's going to do it again. Legacy is hard because our country moves on very, very quickly. I'm a pollster after 9/11. 6 months later, when all the press is writing, we're going to remember this forever, I would say to the press in the 1-year anniversary, I'd say to the press in terms of, okay, in Washington, New York, and in Boston, it was still residual because we were attacked here, but how much the country had already moved on. And I said, I really wrestle with this question. Is it say something powerful about this country's capacity for change, that even something this horrible, that we've moved on this fast, or is it depressing that in America that we, in a year, we've so much tossed off that terrible event? This country, as a pollster, has the most extraordinary capacity for change. And I wrestle every day with, is that the genius of this country or is that the defect of this country? And for the most part, like the pace at which this country adopts social change and the record we have in the world of tolerance and all the other things that make up this country, that capacity for change is, I think, the particular genius of this country, but it leaves everyone behind very quickly. And it's very hard to have an enduring legacy. It's very hard to have an enduring legacy without being president. But my hope is that the things that we should admire about John McCain, they really are a uniquely American story. He represents some of those core American values. And what you'd like to think is that when he says you should believe in something bigger than yourself, and you should devote yourself to some cause bigger than yourself and some cause to move this country forward, to any residual way, any of that is what gets remembered. That's a very powerful legacy.